Over the next few episodes, we're going to continue to explore the world of ideas. And these ideas were collected, collated, and organized into a book that was published in 1859 called On the Origin of Species. Well, that wasn't exactly its first title. It was much longer, but that's the one it's best known by today. And its author, Charles Darwin, examined the evidence and stressed over its implications. He worked on the defense of his book for over 2 decades before being practically pushed into publication when another man, Alfred Russel Wallace, came up with the same solution. The problem being solved for was a theory that would explain the abundance of life around us with all of its beauty and elegant forms. But Darwin and Wallace hadn't been the only ones to work on the theory. There were others. And today, we're going to look at one man from France who, like Darwin, wanted to be sure.
There is grandeur in this view of life.
Welcome to Evolution Talk with Rick Coast, an introduction to the oldest story ever told.
Great ideas aren't conceived in a vacuum. Think of them like jigsaw puzzles with imperfect pieces. Some fit better together than others. The pieces may appear to fit together, and they are left that way until someone realizes that they might have actually been forced together. Some minds begin to see the picture even before all of the pieces are in place. But to see the picture, to truly appreciate its beauty, the pieces of the puzzle must first be dumped onto the table. Charles Darwin had such a mind. Pieces of the puzzle had been put together, and there were also pieces that had been forced into position to present a picture that wasn't quite right. William Paley's work on the puzzle is one example. Paley pushed the pieces together to form a watch, and he then said that God did it. Plato said that the puzzle itself was imperfect and represented unattainable perfection. But there were others who worked painstakingly hard on their pieces and left them there for others to finish. As Bernard de Chartres is credited to have said,
"We see more and farther than our predecessors, not because we have keener vision or greater height, but because we are lifted up and borne aloft on their gigantic stature."
One such man is Benoit de Maillet, and this is the story of a book he worked on for pretty much all of his life. The book is called Telliamed. Our story starts in Cairo, where Maillet served as the French consul in the French quarter of Cairo. He was there to oversee and to protect the interests of France. And by all accounts, he did his job really well. He wasn't a scientist, and nor was he inclined to be one, but what he was curious. Extremely curious, and his curiosity took him into areas that most men of his stature would have stayed away from. He had duties to perform, which he did during the day, but at night he would retreat to his quarters and write. Of course, there were letters to be written, letters bound for France as was part of his duty, but there was also pages of a book, many pages that he preferred to keep hidden during the day, at least from prying eyes. And why is this? It's because those pages contained observations and ideas, and some would say they were dangerous ideas. And they were. Benoit de Maillet felt that he had figured out the origins of life and how the many species that populate the earth came to be. Maillet had started his book in 1697, and the ideas that pushed him into completing those first few pages surprised even himself. This wasn't the sort of book he ever imagined he would one day be writing. It was his curiosity that drove him to those ideas, curiosity that led him to books by ancient philosophers that convinced him to look at life differently. And not only life, but the world around him, the actual Earth, and the fact that the continents and the land masses appeared to shift and mold themselves into different shapes and forms. He came across old and dusty texts that described sea journeys between Alexandria and the islands of Pharos. But what struck him was that these journeys, the ones described in these old books, they were unnecessary. As he lived and breathed, those land masses were connected. There was no need to make the trip by sea. And there were other examples that perplexed him. In Memphis, and when I say Memphis, that's Memphis in Egypt for all of you Elvis fans. In Memphis, he read about and saw for himself giant rings embedded in stone that were used to moor great boats. And he marveled at this, imagining the great ships that must have pulled into dock in Memphis, their long ropes tied to these massive iron rings. And the problem was that Memphis was inland. There were no shores for boats to arrive at. There was only sand. It was observations like this that led Maillet to conclude that the Earth was old, extremely old, not thousands of years old as many believed, but billions of years old enough for the land to change and to transform into different shapes that his ancestors wouldn't even recognize. The change wouldn't be noticeable during anyone's lifetime, but as generations came and went, the changes were there. As I mentioned, Maillet started his book in 1697. He was 41 years old, not a very young man for that time. And if you had told him that he would be working on his book for the next 40 years, he wouldn't have believed you, nor would he have wanted to believe you. As it was, he didn't finish it until 1735, and to say it was finished is a little bit misleading. What he had in 1735 wasn't so much a book. He had chests full of pages that needed to be edited. So, why had he worked in his book for so long? It's because, like Charles Darwin would do well over a century later, Maillet wanted to be sure. He wanted his ideas to be airtight. They needed to be if they were to be accepted. He was a perfectionist. And his job as French consul meant that he had to have an eye for detail and the ability to discern truth in chaos. And he used that skill when it came to tackling the problem of life and how it got there, or how it got here. You see, Maillet believed that life, all of life, came from the sea. And not only did it come from the sea, but it continued to evolve into different species as those species spread out to encounter different environments.
Who can doubt that from the volatile fish sprung our birds, which raise themselves in the air, and that from those which creep in the sea arose our terrestrial animals, which have neither a disposition to fly, nor the art of raising themselves above the earth?
Now, to present these ideas would be dangerous to him. He was, after all, a respectable man tasked with an important job. He was embedded in politics. To publish the pages that were growing in number by the day, he would need to come up with a way to, in a sense, distance himself from these pages. He knew what publishing a book like this would do to him and to his career. Everything he'd worked so hard for would be lost. And he didn't wish to go the route of publishing anonymously either. Others had done that, but Maillet was too proud. So he came up with an idea. Why not present his work as a work of fiction instead? There were plenty of fictional tales out there of fantastic ideas and even more fantastic voyages. If he himself were to say that birds sprung from fish, he would be branded as a heretic. But if a character in a story were to say the same thing, that would be different. He could always claim that he didn't hold these ideas, it was his character. So that's exactly what he did. He created a character named Telliamed, and Telliamed became his mouthpiece. And if you think Telliamed is an odd name, well, it is. It's his own last name, only backwards. In his book, Telliamed is an Indian sage with great and strange wisdom that he then imparts to the narrator of the story. The wisdom includes the idea that all of life on Earth originated in the sea and that it spread out from there. One has only to look at that life closely to see the evidence. It's all there. in the elements.
If we pass metals, earth, wood, plants, animate or inanimate bodies,
Remember, Telliamed said this. Benoit de Maillet did not.
whatever the earth includes or produces, and in short, fresh water through an alembic, we find salt in each of them, and discover the vestiges of the sea, to which all things owe their origin.
Like Lucretius had said in his poetic works, there was no creator in Maillet's tale. Everything was chance. From primitive creatures sprang life, even man.
There is in all men an indelible mark that they draw their origin from the sea. In a word, consider their skin with one of our lately invented microscopes, which magnify a grain of sand to the bulk of an ostrich's egg, and you will find it all covered with small scales like those of a carp.
Maillet was tireless when it came to his work, often working late into the night. He fed the character of Telliamed his own views about how life on the planet came to be, and everywhere he looked, he saw evidence that animals on land must have come from an earlier form of animal in the sea.
As for the origin of terrestrial animals,
He wrote,
I observe that there are none of them, whether walking, flying, or creeping, the similar species of which are not contained in the sea, and the passage of which from one of these elements to another is not only possible and probable, but even supported by a prodigious number of examples.
It's lines such as these that would get him into trouble were they to be made known, especially when they contradicted the teachings of the church. So instead of slowing down or trying to organize his work into something a little more manageable, he forged on. He needed to capture every idea and example that there was to capture. He needed people to accept what he was saying, even if he were presenting it as a fictional or as the fictional utterances of an Indian sage. The beast that was Telliamed had begun to worry Maillet. The book had become so big and so expansive that he couldn't find a way out of it, and he was beginning to panic. He wasn't a young man anymore. He was well into his later years, and time for him was basically running out. If something were to happen to him before completing his work, it would be lost forever. He needed help, and he needed someone that he could trust. In desperation, he turned to a fellow French author, Bernard de Fontenelle, for advice. And what did Fontenelle say? He told Maillet that Maillet needed to expand his book and that it needed even stronger evidence. Not exactly something that Maillet needed to hear. But according to Fontenelle, if Maillet was to expand on some of his ideas in the book would be unstoppable. It would become virtually a sensation. There was not a person in the world who didn't want to know the origins of life, especially if those origins contradicted what the church had been saying for centuries. So Maillet continued to pour himself into his work. He had to show that organisms adapted to new environments and developed into different species over time. When he looked at plants, he saw seaweed, and when he looked at birds, he saw flying fish. And when it came to the origin of man himself, he saw something else. And what he saw would become his boldest assertion and his greatest blunder.
This account testifies that on the 23rd of May, these Frenchmen and Negroes, having gone in a boat to the islands of the Diamant in order to fish,
It was with these words that Maillet revealed his thoughts on the origin of man.
and returning about sunset, they saw near the shore of an island where they were a sea monster of a human form from the middle upwards and terminating below like a fish.
Yes, Maillet is talking about mermaids. And I'm not kidding. And neither was Maillet. He could always claim, again, that this was a work of fiction. But he truly believed he was onto something here. It solved a problem for him. Remember, Maillet's entire argument was that all of life on Earth originated in the sea. And for this to be true, he needed proof. It's what he spent his life doing, building his case. Flying fish became birds, fish crawled out of the sea to become animals, but what he needed was something that accounted for man himself. He needed a transitional species, one that stood between fish and man. In stories of mermaid sightings, Maillet felt he had the final piece to the puzzle. Mermaids and mermen were the transitional species between fish and man he'd been looking for. So he collected stories of sightings, and some of these sightings were fairly well documented, and he relied on these stories to support his case. There were tales of strange men and strange women emerging from the sea who found themselves unable to cope on land. And there were still other tales of beastly, bearded men who burst forth from the waves with fins where their legs should be. And Maillet felt that the picture he was painting was finally near completion. He now needed to put it all together. To help give his book structure, he handed it over to Jean-Baptiste de Maillet, and Maillet would serve as editor for Maillet's great work, and it wouldn't be an easy job. The manuscript, like I said, was massive and all over the place as far as its narrative went. And to further complicate matters, Maillet had to deal with Maillet himself. Although Maillet was eager to see his work published, he really couldn't leave it alone. Remember, this was Maillet's life. He needed it to be perfect. He'd been working on it for decades, for 4 decades as a matter of fact. Who else can say that they'd worked on any project for that long? Maillet received constant letters containing new directions from Maillet. And not only that, but Maillet couldn't stop writing. The editor even received new material to add to the work constantly. The edits were endless. And then, the letters stopped. Benoit de Maillet had died at the age of 82. So, with the storm of edits and requests to add material behind him, Maillet breathed a sigh of relief, and he took his time. A lot of time. It would be another 10 years before the book was ready for publication, and this was in 1748. Benoit de Maillet had died in 1738. And the sad part is, not only had Maillet died before seeing his life's work reach the public's eye, there were portions of the book that even he would not have recognized himself. Maillet had taken liberties with the book and the edits that Maillet would have been horrified to read. The book, as Maillet had originally written it and composed it, would never have passed the Paris censors, and Maillet was sure of that. In order to make it a little bit more palatable, even with it being presented as a work of fiction, he needed to make a few adjustments. Maillet wasn't around to stop him or to ask permission, so Maillet did what he thought best. And one of his changes concerned the role of God. Maillet's book had no place for a creator. It was blind chance and random processes that produced the earth and even life itself. Catering to the watchful eye of the church, Maillet introduced the hand of God, and he also structured the book into 6 sections to represent the 6 days of creation. Maillet would have been appalled and heartbroken, but he would also have been pleased at the book's reception. The book was a sensation, and it was scandalous. It had exactly the impact at the time that Maillet had hoped it would. The true shame in this entire story is that nobody today has even heard of this book. Talk about heartbreak. In 1968, a new edited edition and translation of Telliamed was published. This version, put together by Albert Carozzi, stayed true to Maillet's original work and intentions by reconstructing it using the earliest surviving manuscripts. 230 years after his death, the world can finally read what Benoit de Maillet really wanted to say. Mermaids and all. So I hope you enjoyed today's show. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback on today's show or even a future show, please let me know by using the site's contact page, or you can always reach me on Twitter at Rick Coast. And most of all, thank you very much for listening. And until next time, please take care of yourself.
Evolution Talk is a Rick Coast production.